Today, we are diving headfirst into a genuinely cinematic story. We're tracking the meteoric rise of Jeff Bezos and the birth of Amazon, a company that, let's face it, completely rewired the DNA of global retail forever. Whether you're absolutely awestruck by the sheer scale of what he built, or you're questioning the very real human cost of that relentless efficiency, there is just no denying the absolute magnitude of the Bezos empire. Okay, so picture this. It's the spring of 1994. Jeff Bezos is sitting there as a highly successful vice president at a Wall Street hedge fund, and he stumbles across this jaw-dropping statistic. Internet usage is growing at 2,300% a year. I mean, think about that. Things simply do not grow that fast in the real world. But for Bezos, that massive, explosive number wasn't just some random data point. It was literally the spark that ignited a global empire. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the young tinkerer. So from age 4 all the way to 16, Bezos spent his summers out on his grandfather's massive 25,000-acre cattle ranch in Texas. And this wasn't some relaxing summer camp, It was a masterclass in extreme self-reliance. Out there on the ranch, if a giant D6 Caterpillar bulldozer broke down, you couldn't just call a mechanic to come fix it. You literally had to build a crane yourself just to lift the massive gears out. It taught him early on that when you face a seemingly impossible problem, you just have to figure out a way to invent a solution. And honestly, that mechanical obsession started ridiculously early. Get this. As a toddler, Bezos literally dismantled his own crib with a screwdriver. No way, right? Growing up, he was booby-trapping his bedroom with alarms just to keep his siblings out, and he basically turned his parents' garage into a full-blown science lab. He was a self-described nerd who actually went to Princeton aiming to be a theoretical physicist. But, after struggling with quantum mechanics, he wisely decided, actually, let's pivot, and pointed that intense curiosity toward computer science instead. Moving right along to Section 2, minimizing future regret. Fast forward to 1994. Bezos is at D.E. Shaw on Wall Street. He's pulling in a seriously lucrative salary, and he's staring down this massive, life-altering decision. To make the leap, he came up with this mental model he called the regret minimization framework. I know, it sounds incredibly dorky, but it is actually brilliant. He basically projected himself forward to being 80 years old and asked, will I regret walking away from my cushy Wall Street bonus? No. But will I regret missing out on the very beginning of this internet thing? The answer was a massive, resounding yes. So this framework kind of clarified the whole shebang. He knew that if he started an internet company and it completely crashed and burned, the sting of that failure would eventually fade. But the agonizing regret of never having even tried, that would haunt him every single day. So he packs his bags, his wife Mackenzie gets behind the wheel of their 1988 Chevy Blazer, and they drive all the way across the country to Seattle to sell books on a digital network that most people hadn't even heard of yet. Which brings us to Section 3, starting in a garage. Now, the stakes here were astronomical. Bezos' parents staked $300,000 to fund his dream. That was a huge chunk of their life savings. And the craziest part? Bezos actually sat them down and explicitly warned them that there was a 70% chance they were going to lose their entire investment. His dad didn't even really know what the internet was at that point. As his mom said later on, they weren't betting on the internet. They were just betting on Jeff. And man, those early days were a relentless, unglamorous grind. We're not talking about some sophisticated modern warehouse here. They had extension cords running out to a rented garage and desks literally made out of wooden doors they bought from Home Depot. At first, they were packing orders on their hands and knees on the hard concrete floor, until someone finally said, hey, we should probably just buy some packing tables, which of course instantly doubled their productivity. Oh, and here's a brilliant little tidbit. To get around book distributors who forced them to buy a minimum of 10 books per order, Bezos found this hilarious loophole. Amazon would order the one book a customer actually wanted and then request 9 copies of this super obscure, completely out-of-stock book about lichens just to hit the minimum. Genius, right? All right, let's get into Section 4, building the empire. So the test site goes live in July of 1995, and boom, within 30 days, they've shipped books to all 50 states and 45 different countries, with almost zero press coverage. Things move at lightning speed from here. By 1997, they IPO on the NASDAQ at $18 a share. And by 1999, just a handful of years out of that rented garage, Amazon's total stock market value rockets past $30 billion. This little upstart tech company was suddenly worth more than the century-old retail giant Sears. Now, to actually survive losing millions of dollars a year during this explosive expansion, Bezos hammered in some really rigid core philosophies. You absolutely have to think like an owner, not a renter. You have to obsessively earn your customers' trust by doing the hard things well over and over again. And above all else, time horizons matter. His mindset was, if you just focus on the long term, you can accomplish things your short-sighted competitors can't even fathom. Just take a look at this. In Amazon's original 1997 shareholder letter, Bezos bluntly warned Wall Street from day one, saying it's all about the long term. He straight up refused to manage the company just to hit short-term quarterly profits. Instead, he chose to aggressively reinvest every single dime back into expanding their market dominance. It was a massive risk at the time, but it literally became the blueprint for how the modern tech industry operates today. But of course, there is another side to the story. Section 5, the cost of speed. To really understand Amazon, you have to understand that the company is essentially an extension of Jeff Bezos' own brain. And investigative journalists and biographers, like Brad Stone in his book The Everything Store, have reported on what they describe as a pretty brutal internal culture. Bezos has often been described by critics as lacking empathy, making hyper-rational business decisions that treat workers more like expendable resources than people. For him, personnel issues often take a backseat. The singular, relentless obsession is always company performance and serving the customer. And you can see this dynamic play out physically on the floor of the fulfillment centers. Critics often point to internal documents, like a 2020 ergonomics report about reducing workplace injuries. In it, a safety project was actually rejected because, quote, it only looked at minimizing risk for taller associates. There was no solution for other associates. People look at cases like this as clear evidence of an injury-productivity trade-off. They argue that this absolute mandate for speed creates an environment where worker safety is actively compromised just to maintain efficiency. Which leads us to our final chapter. Section 6, Life Beyond Amazon. As his personal wealth exploded well past the $100 billion mark, his influence started rippling out globally. He completely shocked the media world when he bought the Washington Post back in 2013. He bridged the gap between the digital and physical world by acquiring Whole Foods in 2017. And then finally, in 2021, he officially stepped down as Amazon's day-to-day CEO. He transitioned to executive chairman, mostly to free himself up to focus on his absolute oldest childhood passion, space. And to fund his private spaceflight company, Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos does something kind of mind-bending. He sells $1 billion in Amazon stock every single year. Let that sink in. It is this massive, ongoing wealth transfer straight from e-commerce into rocketry, all aimed at his grand vision of eventually moving polluting heavy industry entirely off of planet Earth. Now, naturally, this has drawn some intense scrutiny. A lot of people look at this billionaire space race and see a wasteful ego contest. They argue that all of this unbelievable wealth should be directed entirely at immediate, crushing crises like global poverty and climate change. And Bezos himself actually acknowledges this criticism. He impartially states that the critics are largely right. We absolutely do have to fix the problems here and now on Earth. But he argues that as a species, we have to do both. We have to simultaneously build the infrastructure, a literal road to space, so that future generations can survive and thrive. And that leaves us right here, looking at the whole picture. From a toddler taking apart his own crib, to a young guy fixing heavy machinery out in Texas, to a pioneer who packed books on his knees to build a trillion-dollar empire, he used that regret minimization framework to completely alter the course of his own life. And now, he's basically trying to apply that exact same framework to the future of humanity. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. When the history books are finally written, will Jeff Bezos' ultimate legacy be defined by how completely he transformed daily life here on Earth, or by that literal road he's trying to build to the stars? Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer, guys, and keep learning.